Hi everyone, it's Sherry from Our Life Homeschooling, where I share homeschooling encouragement for everyday moms. Today I want to talk to you about a homeschool narration and how we use it in our large family. If you're new to my channel, my name is Sherry. I'm a homeschooling mom to 10 kids. I'm married to my high school sweetheart Nelson. We've been married for 23 years. I'm a former public school teacher turned homeschool mom. I love coming on here every week and encouraging you, the homeschool mom, in the great work that you're doing at home. At the beginning of the year, I mentioned that one of my goals this year was to focus more on narration in our homeschool. So that's been something I've been reading a lot more about, thinking more about. I've been reading the book Know and Tell by Karen Glass. It's excellent. And I want to come on here and just help moms. I've had a couple moms ask me, what is narration? Can you just explain it from the very basics? So that's what I'm going to attempt to do today. I've also written a blog post on this that just really lays everything out in detail if you find that an easier way to learn, or if you want to just go back and reference different things. I also have in there some samples of narrations that my kids have given, if that is something that would be helpful for you. Narration is a hidden gem. If you're not using narration along with Copywork, which I think is another super tool, I've done other videos on Copywork. In fact, I'll make sure to link at least one of them for you in the notes below. But if you're not using narration in your homeschool, you are missing out on one of the most effective tools for helping your kids become good communicators, good writers. What is narration? It's simply telling. In fact, it's something that's so simple that I think a lot of parents either overthink it or overlook it because it just seems too simple. It's almost like they can't understand it or grasp it because it's just can't be that good if kids are just telling. They tell all the time. How can this be anything special, or how can this develop good writers in children? In fact, there's a good chance that you're already using it in your homeschool. When you ask your kids to tell about their day, or if you're sitting around the dinner table and you're asking them different questions about different things that they've done, this is them telling. It's something that's natural, and narration is starting with that natural inclination that kids have to tell stories and turning it into writing. So they begin with oral narrations, and then eventually when they become fluent at that, they progress to putting it to pen and writing narrations. Now, as I mentioned before, narration is such an effective tool for developing good writers. So why is it so effective? When I was in college, I studied education, later went on to do my student teaching. I taught in the public schools for a couple years. When I was in class, in one of my education class, we learned about Bloom's taxonomy. If you're a former teacher, that would be something that would be very familiar to you. It was a hierarchy of questioning. So you wanted to get your kids, you wanted to ask questions that were higher up on this level of Bloom's taxonomy that was going to evoke deeper thinking for them, more creative thinking, analytical thinking. So at the very bottom of this triangle of Bloom's taxonomy, the very bottom is just answering measurable, objective questions. What did you see when you were at the playground? And it would just have an obvious answer. This would be like multiple choice questions. What was there? What was at the playground? A bird, a ball, or a swing? These are very basic questions that require very little thinking. And what we were taught as up-and-coming teachers was to try to ask questions that would evoke higher levels of thinking. So higher up on this triangle of questioning. And when you got to the top level, you were asking questions that were deeper, that would make kids really reason a little bit more. And as I was reading the book Know and Tell, The Art of Narration by Karen Glass, She gave a statement that just really resonated with me when I was reflecting back on how we learned this in college. And it just showed to me why narration is so superior. And it starts with the higher level thinking. She says, a teacher may suppose that leading children through a series of questions will teach children to think and reason for themselves. However, the one who asks the question is the one who has thought about the material the most. When you have your kids narrate, you are having them start at the highest level of thinking. In fact, they are sorting, putting things into order, deciding what's important, what's not important, and giving you a retelling of the story so that they actually are the most fit to create a test or create a quiz. The person who has thought about the material the most, who has thought about the questions, is the one that's most ready to make a test. The one who's asked the questions is the one that is the most familiar with the material. And that is what narration does for kids. It starts them at that highest level of thinking, and they become the most familiar with the material because they are asking the questions. So narration really replaces multiple choice, fill in the blank type quizzes and tests that we all grew up with. It's so much better than this because it actually requires them to know the material well. They're not just having to go back and think about one particular thing that just happens to be on this test that maybe wasn't really important to their version of what they saw or what they read. Narration is superior to quizzing and to tests. It replaces them because it's a better method. If you have a hard time believing this, I think the best way to convince you is to try it yourself. I've done this myself. I read a short paragraph of a book several years ago, and I handed it over to my husband and I tried to narrate to him. And it was a lot harder than I thought it would be. You're really sifting through thoughts and ideas and deciding what comes first, well then what came next, and then what's at the end, and then what's important and what should I leave out. It requires a lot of brain thought. And then what happens after you give a narration is the material is cemented in your brain. You just know it a lot better than if you had read it, walked away, or even if you had read it and been quizzed on it. You have digested the material, the content, and presented it to someone else. How do you teach narration? I'm going to give it to you in 3 basic steps. The first step is that you have to start with quality literature. Your kids cannot express what they don't possess. If you're asking them to give a narration and you're only reading to them just silly little cartoon style books, twaddle, they're just going to they're going to regurgitate something that sounds like what they ate for breakfast. It's not going to be interesting. It's not going to be engaging. You have to be reading quality living books to your kids. The second step is oral narrations. And like I mentioned before, this is probably something that you are already doing. From the time our kids start talking, we're asking them to tell back to us about their day, about the time at grandma's, about what it was like at the park. They're already doing this. I start being more intentional with this around the age of 6. So when my kids are 6, I start slowly and I'll do a short reading. And instead of asking them to tell back to me at the end of the reading, I start with just short paragraphs or a page. So I'll read a part of the story and then I'll stop and say, all right, now tell back to me what I read so far. Because if you read a whole book, a whole long section, for young children, it's really hard for them to remember all those details by the time you come to the end. So with a new child that's narrating more focused for the first time, I start in small sections. If you want to see the fruit of narration, you really need to be consistent and make it something that you do daily. I try to make sure I do it with my young kids at least every day, have them give an oral narration. If you want to do more, you can. I wouldn't overdo it, But just make sure you're being consistent and doing it daily. It's a long game. If you do it regularly over a period of time, you're gonna see great fruit, but don't expect your kids to get better at it if you're inconsistent. Now, one thing I think that's really important to know when you're starting out with a young child is not to be discouraged by their first narrations. The first narrations that a child gives, and this is other than those ones that come naturally when they're young and you're just asking them about their day. When you're being more intentional about it, the first narrations they give are not going to be good. They're going to be confused because what you're training them to do, you're training their power of attention. So the first time you read and you have them tell back to you, they're not paying as close attention as they will be after the 10th time when they realize that they have to give this information back. Up to this point, they may be listening to a lot of stories and taking in this important fact or that important detail, but they're not paying close enough attention to the point that they're going to have to tell all of it back to you in detail. So their first narrations are probably not going to be good. And it's really important not to be discouraged by that, but to just know that if you keep being consistent and keep doing it every day, you're gonna see progress. In fact, I've noticed with my kids, it usually takes, maybe five or six times with a new narrator before they finally realize that they really need to pay attention, that's really what it comes down to. So they start really listening to the details. The third step to teaching homeschool narration is written narration. Now, if you've been doing oral narration with your kids every day, consistently, over a period of time, they are just naturally going to be ready to write it. They're doing this, it requires no more work than what they've already been doing. They're doing the same thing. They're telling the story back, but now they're just putting pen to paper and writing out what they've been saying already. Now, all kids are going to be ready for this at different times because kids are individuals and they develop at different paces. Ambleside Online, I think Charlotte Mason recommended around 4th grades. That would be around age 9 or 10, but it's going to be different for each of your kids. So when you have a child, one of the most important things is that they can handwrite fluently. So if handwriting is a struggle for them still, they're probably not ready to do written narrations. Once handwriting is just something so fluent for them and it's easy, then they can start doing written narrations. One of the ways that I transition from oral narrations to written is by having my kids give me the oral narration that we've been doing all this time, and I type it out. So I type it out word for word. Every mistake, every like, I put it in there, and then I have them look at it and I have them read it out loud to me. And when they read it out loud and they see their narration in writing, it helps them to see some of the ways they can improve. This is the first step that I do. And then next, when I feel like they're ready, I let them go ahead and start. And first, I would say about a half a page or whatever feels comfortable for them. And you can start by having them type it if that's easier. I start by having my kids just write it out with pen and paper, but once they are familiar with it, are doing it a lot of them do like to type their narrations. And again, as it becomes something that's easier and easier for them to do, it's great to have them read it back to you. A lot of times when my kids are reading their narrations back to me, they're realizing that they can't even read their own handwriting, or that they really didn't pay attention or didn't give, then they start making their own corrections in their mind, like, oh wait, that didn't happen next. So they're able sometimes to see how they can improve and see some of their mistakes on their own. When I have our kids start with written narration, we start with just 1 week. And we continue to do oral narrations. I think this is really important because it continues that brain process of them really thinking through what happened and how to tell it back in the best way. So continue with oral narrations, but when you start, have them do just 1 written narration a week. And Karen Glass in her book suggests working up to 4 narrations per week, With my kids, I do 2. We work up to 2. Now, I've gone through certain seasons where we've really focused on narration and we've done more in a week, but in general, 2 is what works for us. Find the balance that works for you. You'll know what seems like too much. Now, I think it's important to let them write out the whole narration without any interruption or guidance from you, to really think all the way through it themselves. But afterwards, I think it is okay as well to give them a little bit of instruction, especially as far as mechanics, capitalization, punctuation, spelling, little things like that, just to, point it out or help them to notice it. But it should be their own. It should be their own work. And it's going to come naturally to them. You think that not much is happening when they do these narrations week after week, but if you look back in their notebook, you're going to be able to see, look at the beginning of the year and look at the end of the year. Narration fluency happens naturally. I want to just briefly tell you how we use narration in our large family with several kids. First, I'm always working on oral narration with all my kids that are younger, so the ones that aren't ready to write it out yet. We do this, I try to make sure I do at least one with them a day. I don't write it out, I don't really have a plan, but in my mind, I'm trying to make sure I ask at least one of them every day to narrate something back to me. With my kids that are doing their own written work, I start by giving them just a spiral notebook. I write their name at the top, I write narration under it. That is their narration notebook for the year. And I put on their checklist the certain days that I want them to do it. This is something we go through at the beginning of the year together. We create our checklist together, me and the child individually. And then I expect them to do it. And I randomly check it so they know that I'm going to be looking at them. So this is how we do narration just normally in our family, but there are periods of time where I focus on it more intensely. A couple years ago, I wanted to really focus on narration. I felt like the kids needed to improve in it. So I was reading a short section from George Washington's World every day. That's a book by Genevieve Foster. It's one of my favorites. And I would read it and I would have them do a written narration. We did this at morning time. And so they were doing, I want to say probably at least 4 a week. And we did that for a couple months to just really focus on it. And I think this can be beneficial as well. We really focused on it. It seemed like an intense time. And then when we finished, I decided that was great. We had made a lot of progress, but we just moved back again to the 2 written narrations per week, and that works well for us. I think what's really important is if you need to spend time focusing on it because you want to see some improvement or you want to just make it something that's intentional for you, that's great, but find the balance for how many narrations to require for your kids per week. I hope this has encouraged you. I would love it if you have experience with narration with your kids. I would love it if you would just drop some comments below and let everyone else know what works for you, how you use it in your home, any tips that you have. If you have further questions that I haven't covered in this video, I would love to hear them and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you like the content in this video, I'm going to direct you to this video that I did several months ago, just showing you our step-by-step process of how I teach writing in our homeschool. Thanks for watching today. Have a great week.